Yes.
Oh, boy, that goes down a long way. Okay, welcome everybody to our next panel, The Importance of Ethics in Gene and Cell Therapy. I made a shameless plug for this panel earlier today in my remarks. The one thing I will say is we got some rough customers on this panel. This is going to be a tough one. I can tell you right now. I don't know what to do. I'm very nervous. But listen, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by asking everybody just to introduce themselves. We'll go right down the line if you wouldn't mind. Kath, starting with you.
I'm Kath Bollard. Sorry, I was mic'd up before I realized I was mic'd up, but I'm the Senior Vice President and Chief Research Officer at Children's National Hospital and George Washington University. I also lead the Novel Cell Therapies program there, but then one of my other hats is I'm the current president for the Foundation for the Accreditation of Cellular Therapy, FACT.
Great, thank you. Kevin.
So I'm Kevin FitzGerald. As you can see, I'm a Catholic priest. I'm a Jesuit. So if you have anything to throw, I'm the target. Okay. I am at Creighton University. Our main campus is in Omaha, Nebraska. We also have a health sciences campus in Phoenix. My areas are cancer genetics and bioethics. I'm the chair of the Medical Humanities Department at the Creighton Medical School. I'm also a member of the Pontifical Academy for Life here in Rome, so part of our meeting yesterday.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Kevin. Adora.
And I'm Adora Ndu. I am the Chief Regulatory Officer and Executive Vice President for Portfolio Strategy and Management with BridgeBio Pharma.
Great. So we've got a great representation across sort of academia, religious perspectives meets academia, meets a health system, and biotechnology, right? So great, thanks. Okay, so we've got a few topics we'll talk about, and if we have time at the end, we'll open it up for questions. So the first one, and I touched on these in my introductory comments this morning, but is on global access, the importance of global access within cell and gene therapy. And I think people, Adora, I'll start with you. I think, you know, the typical model within biotech is hard to think about really global access, right? It's tricky in the US and sometimes of course, across Europe and other markets, but we've had some successes, like Zolgensma is probably the biggest test case where it's available in over 50 markets, including Brazil and Ecuador and Egypt, so very atypical markets, which is great news for the SMA community. We have a panel on the Middle East coming at the conference, and Jim Wilson talked about the GEMA model a little bit, right, where they're partnering with the Brazilian government with a very innovative model, and they're looking at potentially partnerships in the Middle East and things. So just when you step back and think about global access, there are opportunities and challenges, and how do you think about the two of them? And then we'll go kind of right down the line. Kevin and then Kath.
Sure, so, I mean, ideally you want to start with the end in mind, which is sort of, you know, the gold standard approach. That said, in the rare or ultra rare space with gene therapies in particular, that can be quite challenging. What I will share is for clinical trials, for example, when there are so few patients, you are having to really search far and wide to identify patients that would qualify to participate in the clinical trials. And so by default, we are, you know, spreading our reach pretty far globally to identify those patients. We're going above and beyond to transport trial participants to the sites. Often you have very few trial sites that you're standing up in this space, so it certainly does present challenges up front. Now that said, there are, you know, additional challenges with ensuring that there is access to treatment globally, and you mentioned Zolgensma as one success model. There are many models out there. You know, I think you know, things that we have to consider are, you know, certain regions and the infrastructure in place. You know, how do we even get treatments to patients? Are we looking at named patient sales? Are we looking at early access schemes? Is there the right infrastructure in place? Is there newborn screening? I mean, we have our challenges with even identifying these patients in the US, not to talk of, you know, lower to middle income countries. And then when you look at the cost of treatment, are we by default excluding, you know, certain parts of the global population just because of the difficulty in even having access to treatments? So these are all considerations that go into really thinking about how do we make these innovative therapies available to a very broad group of patients across the world. And it's a difficult challenge, and it's one that I think, Zolgensma, as you mentioned, is a good model. There are probably many different ways to do it. I would say for us, we have our AAV9 gene therapy in Canavan disease, which is a disease that impacts about 1,000 kids across the US and EU, and so it's a very rare space. And we are going, leaps and bounds to find patients. And that's sort of where we are right now. As we think about commercialization and starting to expand access, we're gonna have to think a little bit differently. In our history, with one of our first approvals, which was for an ultra-rare disease, MOCD type A, we ended up actually partnering that product at the commercial stage so that the partner would take that treatment and make it broadly available. So there are different ways to think about that, but certainly considering challenges and planning up front. So for example, with that product for MOCD type A, required some extreme refrigeration, standards, and so we have to think about how to provide those, specialty refrigerators for storage of those treatments. So I would say, companies working with advocacy groups and working with potential partners to really come up with a model, and ministries of health globally to come up with a model that would work.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Kevin.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think that lays out sort of the challenges that are before us, and would like to say how buoyed I am by the conversations here at this meeting in terms of Emmer Cook talking about how she's getting together with different people from around the world, try to look at these kinds of things. I think, as you mentioned, partnering is key. And then also the issues of, sure, if we're talking ultra rare and rare, we're just trying to get access to the patients, right? If we're talking about something like sickle cell disease, then the question is going to be disparities, right? It's going to be who can afford it, and are they in a place where they can get access to it. So the additional layer that I'd like to put on this is that additional complexity of dealing not just with the institutional and the governmental, but the cultural differences one is going to encounter. How are the people with whatever disease it is you're trying to treat seen in their own environment? How do they interact with the people in their community? How are they held up in their community or marginalized? All those extra dynamics are key to success in terms of us being able to achieve the goals that we have in mind, which are trying to bring at least durable treatments, if not, that magic word, cures. And the example that I always bring up, and it's one that sadly is still relevant today, are genetically modified foods. I mean, back in the 80s, when you talked to the scientists who were coming up with this genetic stacking program, that they could create these seeds that they thought were going to be the next green revolution. And we're still working our way through the cultural issues around frankenfoods and all that sort of thing. So if we want to avoid that, and I think we do want to avoid that, we need to start engaging with those various communities around the world now, and we need to engage with them in a way that engenders trust and not suspicion. So we can't go in and say, boy, have I got a deal for you, right? I am going to solve all your problems, because normally someone then looks at that and says, we've heard that before, and that has not turned out well. So how do we do that engagement? How do we reach out to those patients that we want to reach? And how do we do it in a way that's going to be culturally appropriate for them in their circumstances, not just figuring that the way we do it in the US or in the EU is going to be the way we're going to be doing it elsewhere.
Yeah, it reminds me of a conversation I had with a scientist, not a junior person, in an organization that's a member, and they were saying on this one product, it's all about the data, it's all about the data. And this was a product that's not without some controversy down the road. And I said, well, I don't quite see it that way. I'm not sure it's just about the data. He's like, it's all about the data. I'm like, have you heard of GMOs? Yeah. Have you heard of COVID vaccines? Yeah. I'm not sure. I think when data and science meet society, funny things happen. So, Kath, global access.
Yeah, so I think this is where I was going to talk with my fact hat. Yes. So, I think even in the US, fact has been labeled as a sort of a roadblock to patient access, actually, even in the US. And, I come at this with my cell therapy space, really. I'm not talking about gene therapy. And, obviously, cell therapy in many aspects fits the bone marrow transplant model. And, FACT has really, been that conduit, if you like, for getting facilities, et cetera, ready to be able to deliver these cell therapies to patients even outside of transplant. And so actually, we have heard from this community in particular that this has been a roadblock for smaller programs within the US or, beyond. And just last week, we did issue a press release that we are going to be developing standards specific for smaller programs, which will be relevant to smaller programs internationally. And, FACT has just recently accredited institutions in India, the Middle East, South America, and so we are not just American-based, and we are global, and having that accreditation piece around cell therapy does wakes up governments, I guess, because here you have an internationally recognized accreditation body. You have your institution or your facility or your program that's FACT accredited, and that will then set you apart for as a place that can deliver these therapies no matter where you are in the safest possible way. So,
okay, good. Thank you. Okay. Let's jump over to the ultra-rare conditions, right? So this is a thorny challenge that I think, I have not heard.
Can we do rare and ultra-rare?
Sure, why not?
You said it would be a tough crowd.
Yeah, tough. Absolutely. But this is a thorny one. I've not heard anybody say, I have the answer. I think this is a little bit of an all of the above, have to try many different things depending on the number of patients, the disorder that we're talking about, and whatever. And last year we did a panel on this topic, people might remember, and we had Francesca Passanelli, who at the time, she's since left, but was running San Rafael Telethon, the charity, right? So they've got a big track record of making really ultra rare therapies available, which is very important. I think they only treat a handful of patients, I think, across Europe a year. So you have that model. You have some companies that have built a business around this. Certainly they might do an early program to kind of prove out the technology, even though they will realize early on there's not that many patients. It may not be a big revenue driver, but it's perhaps a strategic fit. You do have nonprofits. You have academic centers. Again, Jim was talking about his model for thinking about both ultra-rare diseases and global access, which I think is a very interesting model. So how do you each see that? And Kath, maybe I can start with you.
Yeah, the reason I wanted to sort of start with rare disease, because as a pediatrician, every disease we treat, certainly in cancer, is rare. So, and we are really in this valley of death situation for pediatric cancer for cell therapies. Even though Kymriah, the first, approval was in pediatric ALL, since then, it's been nothing. And that is such a disappointment. And we have, came out of Rome just last year, New England Journal paper from Franco Locatelli showing very promising data with GD2 CAR T cells for neuroblastoma. But those of us who have been in this sort of space for the last 20 plus years, we know that pharma is just not, it doesn't fit the pharma model because we just don't have the patient volume to support the business model. So I do really two things. I like the concept that Jim was socializing earlier about having a platform, you know, if we can get, and maybe that's easier in cell therapy, that, you know, the platform is a CAR T platform, same manufacturing process. That's why I liked the last section so much. If we can automate everything, it's the same for everybody. And then it's a plug and play, if you like, with the targets. Maybe that's a way we can get sort of pharma interested, because then it's a single platform but across multiple diseases. We're also looking at another novel strategy, I guess. So last year, Crystal Mackel and I and several other leaders within the pediatric cell therapy space published in Nature Medicine a model. It's a non-for-profit entity that we've started called Access for Kids. The idea is that we can probably, you know, go all the way to phase 3 trials, pivotal trials in the academic setting with our GMPs, where we realize that if they're FACT accredited, they've, you know, all the FDA sort of regulations are met, it's not that much more to get to BLA. It is more QA/QC, but you know, there's probably not as much of a gap as you think, and certainly we know from cord blood banks, which do exist in the academic setting, that they are BLA, and so you know we could see a model where we are now doing these trials all the way to approval in the academic setting. It feeds back, and then maybe pharma might want to pick it up, and then any profit we make, it goes back into the non-for-profit, so that we can then do the same with the pipeline. Yeah. We'll see. It's a novel concept. We'll see if it works, but I know, you know, I think there's similar sorts of models in Spain and Italy, honestly, that we could build on as well, that are in this sort of thinking.
Yeah, there's one of these, Craig Martin, who's the former CEO of Global Genes, has started up his orphan drug accelerator, which is it's not purely gene therapy, but they do have a focus on gene therapy. It's a similar, can you take a somewhat de-risked asset, maybe it's got some early, you know, clinical proof, and so it's somewhat de-risked, and then try to scale it up and then get bought out and rinse and repeat.
Yeah, and obviously we've been in a lot of discussion with him. You know, I think, you know, we've got to all do these efforts in parallel, because, you know, we're all in it together, honestly, when we see what the challenges we're facing.
Yeah. Adora, you've got some interesting insights into this world.
Well, you know, Kath, I hear you on all the points that you just made, and it's very real. I would say that, you know, when we think about both rare and ultra rare, because I do think there's space, you know, of thinking a little bit differently across a broader spectrum, but of course, most certainly for ultra rare, thinking a little bit differently about the model that would apply is important, especially in this day and age. I would say that, you know, there are certainly a number of models. You mentioned Craig Martin's, you know, model. We've also looked into the role a nonprofit could play in advancing some of these treatments, especially those that have gone through a certain level of de-risking, those that have beautiful science and have been just placed on the shelf just because of, you know, commercial viability. And the reality is, when you go across academic institutions, researchers, pharma, biotech, there are so many of these assets just sitting, collecting dust. And as these assets sit on shelves, they're obviously not getting into the hands of patients that need them the most. And so you see a lot of funding going into the very early non-clinical development, and then a significant cliff going into the clinic. And that's an opportunity for us to really think about, how do we address this cliff? How do we address this valley of death, so that we can bring more treatments to patients? Not every treatment is going to be for weight loss. Some need to be innovative first, you know, in disease. I mean, we need them. That's the reality. You heard from Jim, you know, the large percentage of diseases that are in the smaller rare category. And leveraging efficiencies such as the platform approach become really important, I think, not just with the CAR-Ts, but also with AAVs, you know. The opportunity there, we've seen some advancement that has been a little bit more meaningful than prior years, but we need to go even further. I think the level of clarification on what does it mean to have things like the platform designation? How much streamlining and efficiency can you really obtain? Because within the model of a nonprofit, to the extent that you're able to leverage the technology across many assets to address many diseases and create that efficiency, that drives the interest, especially when you're looking at philanthropic dollars. You know, across the conversations that I've had over the last year and a half, there's interest in being able to address more than one disease. You know, so if I donate X million dollars, how many patients can I reach? How fast can you go? How many assets can you bring, you know, across the finish line? And so those efficiencies really matter, especially on the regulatory front. So there's sort of a need to bring the, you know, innovative model and the regulatory barriers and frameworks, sort of a meeting of the minds together to really sort of think through how can we realistically and tangibly gain some efficiencies, because it is going to be important.
Yeah, we're big proponents of platform technologies, and we did a lengthy workshop, a full-day workshop with the FDA back in November of last year on gene editing as a platform. And it really, when you think about what it could do, it could really accelerate in many ways sort of the industrialization of the field, because you could really look at it from a commercial perspective, from a helping patients perspective, from a technology perspective, cost of goods. A lot of things could potentially be accelerated, decreased, and pushed out more to patients. And so we were pleased to hear Emer Cook talk about that a little bit today, because there is the notion of could we, because nothing is set yet in the world of gene editing, at least as a platform, could you get some kind of guidance out of the FDA? Could you get some clarity out of the EMA and maybe the MHRA, which would allow things just to accelerate even further? So that's watch this space. And the FDA has said I believe they want to put out guidance on the topic this year, though they've been busy with a lot of other things. So, yeah. Kevin, ultra rare and ultra rare.
Well, I have a little bit of trouble with the concept, because it takes me back to, I think this was September of 2008, when the Secretary's Advisory Committee for Genetics, Health, and Society we were holding a meeting, and Secretary Mike Leavitt came in, Secretary of HHS, and that was the pronunciation of the age of personalized medicine. Well, if the medicine is personalized, I think it's all ultra rare. Yeah. And this was, at the time, you know, the great excitement. We were going to have the right treatment for the right person at the right time. And of course, that raised the question of what did people think they were getting before that? But we didn't want to go there. But if the goal is individualized medicine, then we might need to look at this from a conceptual framework in a very different way. Not saying that we don't need to do the things that you're talking about right now, which of course that's because that's the structure that we have. But my concern is that we continue on a trajectory that is misaligned with what we claim are our ultimate goals, right? So now, how do we kind of try to get those two to fit back together? Well, one of the ways in which in the United States, because we don't have a nationalized healthcare system, but the idea is what we're calling learning health centers, right? And you come to the hospital does everything it can for you, and to bring all AI and all the cell and gene therapies and all the different technologies together, focused on you. What do you give back in gratitude for that? Well, your information, your biological sample, those kinds of things. Yeah, it's a really interesting model. Now, it's fascinating to wrestle with that model in a situation like the United States, which is very individualized in our ethics and all this sort of thing. But the fascinating part for me is the vast majority of the world doesn't look at things the way we do in the United States. They don't see all these individuals running around sort of negotiating for themselves, but they are more community-based. Well, a community-based approach is actually very much more aligned with this idea of saying, how does a community benefit, and then what does the community give back, right? And they're doing it together. So I think we have opportunities for some really rich conversations around some of these issues. Again, globally, let's engage all these different communities, because my guess is, first of all, we may be very surprised at how they perceive this situation. And then secondly, we may learn a few things about how to get along with one another that we're not doing so very well at the moment.
Yep. Good. Great. Well, third topic, and I touched on this morning as well, this notion of, and Kevin, I'll start with you, this notion of heritable human genome editing, right? So not the somatic cell editing, all the stuff that we do, that this conference is all about, but then you have this sort of very speculative science that gets into this world of designer babies that we heard a lot about a few years ago, and we held a conference with ASGCT and the American Society of Cell and Gene Therapy and the International Society of Cell and Gene Therapy on the 26th of March, and you participated in that, and we heard from lots of diverse voices, patients, religious leaders, leading scientists, biotech executives, bioethicists, the whole gamish. And what did you hear at that time? Tell us more about that, and I've got one follow-up question.
Yeah. So this is, I mean, as you probably all know, this is a topic that's been going on for some time, somatic cell versus germline. And it's a much easier line of demarcation to draw than therapy versus enhancement. So I think it's easier to address in that sense. Where again we run into trouble is with a way of approaching things that I think has gotten us in difficulties many times up to this point, and that is a lack of transparency. Again, I get it. We're in a business, and a business has to sell. My father was a salesman. That's what he did. But I think we have to be more careful with these technologies not to give people false impressions of what it can and will do. And this is one area where I think we've had a lot of false impressions. And what was so great about the meeting was from a very scientific perspective, right? We are not there yet. And we're not even close to being there yet. And again, we can understand why we're not there yet because of the complexities that one sees early on in human development. The levels of mosaicism that occur not just within the embryo and the cells of the embryo, but the mosaicism that can occur within a cell itself. So what is happening is the fact that we would have to understand the expression of that genetic intervention in each of the cells as they're developing and as they're changing and differentiating as they go along in development, and the ways in which that particular genetic intervention then interacts with all those epigenetic interactions and everything else. So when you stop and really think about it, all right, this is not something that is ready, not for market, not even ready for research. And yet, there are people who, of course, will push because a variety of reasons, right? It's great to stir up debate. It's wonderful to publish articles. We all have to do that in academia, so that's an easy way to do it. There are a lot of different ways in which one can use something like this. But again, my argument would be, I don't think that's ethical because I don't think that's transparent and honest. And so, yes, there are ways in which progress will be made and insights will be gained in what's going on in the animal industry and how this is being done elsewhere. But, and again, yes, those won't translate strictly to the human being, because as we all know, the animal models have their own limitations, and even non-human primates are different than humans in terms of development, certainly at that early stage of embryonic and fetal development. So why then, right? That was the second question. why do it? Why do we need it? Do we need it? Think of all the things that you've heard about so far in the meeting and will hear about in the next couple of days. All the different possible interventions that we have at our disposal. Do we really at this point in time have identified anything that would be only amenable to this sort of approach, right? And worth all the risks and everything else. Now, again, you have to hear from the patient communities, and the patient communities will say, legitimately and understandably, I would do anything for my children. And I totally agree with that. But I think as any of us that have been involved with the care of children who are dying from cancer or other horrible situations, you also have to tell the parents, but would you do something that might actually shorten the life of your child, that might actually make that shorter life even more burdensome and greater suffering? And when you put it in that framework, of course they won't do that. But it's how we're pitching these things that I think is the real ethical problem.
Yeah, one of the interesting things we heard too was we framed up a few of the questions, just like you said, like what's the real use case given all the alternatives, right? But one of the things we also heard was, geez, you'd have to do so many generations of non-human primate studies to even be able to approach any decent regulator to say we want to try clinical trials. It would take 10 years to 20 years to put together that type of body of evidence. And that would probably even be insufficient.
That would be, right, exactly. So that would give you a lot of good information on how non-human primate embryonic and fetal development goes, which is,
right.
So I guess I was just wanting to bring it back to, we have a lot of education to do to our community. Like, when I say community, I mean people outside of the cell and gene therapy community. An example, our hospital was the first hospital in the US to give the commercial sickle gene therapy, and it was all over the New York Times, and it was a lot of PR. And I had both MDs and non-MDs from my hospital come to me and say, oh, so does that mean now that patient, when he has children, he won't be passing on the sickle cell gene anymore? There was even, this is in the hospital setting, so they really, you say gene therapy, but people don't understand the difference. So I think we need to do a lot of education right back at somatic gene therapy and what that is and what it isn't. So I think that's a good, but I think we as a community are beholden on that, because that really brought it home to me what a massive learning curve we really do have. So it's
fast. Yeah.
It is quite fast.
Yeah.
Yes.
Dora, any views?
No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, the science is evolving so quickly. What we know is that we don't know enough, right? And the piece about education, we are very far behind. I mean, the regulatory frameworks are far behind. I think education, even of our healthcare providers, is even further behind. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to move in whichever direction it is that we decide to go in, but it's got to be informed by the science and by where society is prepared to go with this.
And remember in the US Congress, they were talking about transgender mice instead of transgenic mice. So, I just want to really highlight again the importance of education.
Yeah. A lot of engagement needed, yeah.
Right.
Okay, with that, why don't we open it up to the audience? If anybody has any questions, we're happy to try to grapple with them.
I have a question for you, Tim.
Oh boy, okay. You beat me to it. I was going to come up with another one.
Perhaps you can share a little bit about any work that ARM has been engaged in or discussions around this topic, and your current thinking about it.
On this last topic,
yes,
or the broader area of
this last topic?
Okay, this last topic. So we put a lot of energy. Well, let me go back in time. So ARM back in 2015, our co-founder Michael Werner and the CEO of Sangamo, actually now, and then another, a guy who you know, who's now a board member of ARM, Fyodor Uranov. At the time, he was a senior scientist at Sangamo, and a few other people in the field. I think it was in March of 2015, wrote a commentary in Nature that was titled "Don't Edit the Human Germline." And it was I read it not that long ago because we were, by accident, we didn't do this by design. The event that we had on the 26th landed 10 years to the month from when that was written. And it was really interesting to read it because it was a lot about, wow, the field is really advancing. There's a lot of great things going on. It was written in response to rumors that ended up being true that there was a number of Chinese teams that were working on editing embryos, not for implantation, but just for experimenting. And those papers had started to circulate, I think, in late 2014, so people knew this was going on. So they wanted to get out front and kind of make a strong statement that said, we should not be doing this. We certainly shouldn't be doing it for quite some time. So ARM has been involved, and some companies have been involved in this topic kind of for a while. Later in 2015, and they actually called for there should be some international convening, and by December of 2015, the National Academy of Science, the Royal Society in the UK, and I think the Chinese Academy of Medicine got together and did a big summit, 3-day summit, 2-day summit in Washington, D.C. So we've sort of this long history of it for a decade. And then my predecessor, Janet Lambert, after the genetically modified twins were born in November of 2018, she worked with a number of companies. At the time, I was at Editas Medicine and came up with a pretty strong statement of principles. And on that nice long list of things, it was sort of like, we're not doing this. We pledge we're not doing this. No one should be doing this for the foreseeable future. So that was 2019. And then, but this issue kind of keeps coming up, right? It's, I've said that it's, others have called it potentially kind of the bioethical issue of a generation, and you just keep seeing it. In fact, the great proof of that was we did our event on the 26th of March, as I mentioned, and later that day, a report came out of China in the Wall Street Journal, a very lengthy article about this guy, Dr. He, who brought these designer babies into the world, that he's still at it, and they went and interviewed him at his home, and he said, I think this is a great idea. I'll have to do it for Parkinson's disease and a whole bunch of other big, and we couldn't believe it, like, kaboom, big article in the Wall Street Journal. So this is top of mind for us. We were in discussions with ISCT and ASGCT long before the conference about should we come together and put together some very strong statement to try to get it published in this area, and we're actively looking at that right now. So it's stay tuned for more.
And I think the partnership, obviously you've got Miguel, who's a board member, who's ICT president, but even when I was ICT president, medical tourism was a big area that ICT was very passionate about. And so I think that's very complementary with your efforts in this space as well, because, there's, as you just said, work still happening in other countries that, desperate families and patients.
Yeah. Well, and that's a good point to bring up. And Bruce Levine used to be an ARM board member at UPenn, cell therapy pioneer at UPenn, and he's currently the ethics committee chair at ISCT and is very passionate on this topic. And he's been very passionate on lots of the stem cell clinics and both the US, but also offshore and things like that. I know ISCT's done a lot of, looks like to me, very good work in that area, yeah.
And consider the challenges, we're talking about, all the other panels have talked about, that you face going forward. Do you really want to add this on top as an issue that could derail everything that you're trying to work at, even though, in fact, it has nothing to do with it? Yeah. But again, as Kath said, distinguishing these things in the public, especially when there are people there who are going to benefit from the fact that, we're going to keep muddying these waters and arguing that, no, you have to go ahead, you have to do whatever experiments you can because that's how science progresses, right? So it is an issue of great importance because it could have such great damage to the good that you're trying to do.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I was in Hong Kong when the genetically modified twins got announced at the conference, and I saw David Liu, who just won a breakthrough prize for his work, I think, in whether it was in base editing or prime editing or both. And he looked like he'd been run over by a truck. This is back in 2018. And I'll never forget, he said to me, this is an existential threat to everything we are trying to do. And I've thought about that a lot over the years because people conflate these issues in a moment, and it also gets at this, tricky topic, but there is not a patient, you're not talking about a patient that is walking around with a rare condition or potentially a fatal condition, right? You're talking about trying to bring a child into the world that does not exist yet. And so it does seem like a big throw of the dice given looking at things like on targets, off targets, mosaicism. How do you build just forgetting all the ethical and governance issues for a moment, how do you build just purely a scientific package where you could really feel good that you could go forward with this? Again, considering all, I showed a slide, we've got 2,000 clinical trials going on all over the world in a whole range of diseases, and that's today. What's it going to look like in 10 years? There could be many more things that people are working on.
And I can imagine that and I'd love your thoughts, Kevin, that it opens up just a new frontier of ethical questions and considerations.
So it's funny. So think about, any of you have done animal work, right? So you're doing a genetic intervention, the pups are born, and you recognize the fact that one of the pups, something went seriously wrong. What do? You euthanize the pup. That's what you do. That's the ethical thing to do. What are we going to do with the baby?
Yeah. Right.
So that's, why do we not think about these things ahead of time, right?
Right. Yep. Good. Okay. With our last 3 minutes, final thoughts on the bigger topic: global access, ultra rare, germline editing, generally ethics in society. I'll go right down the list, starting with Adora with you, and work my way, this way.
Global access is important. I mean, we can't develop treatments, with a particular region in mind. We really need to be thinking about the greater good and reaching as many patients as possible. That's why, in our trials, expanding the types of patients that we include in the trials are important so that anyone that takes those treatments can have a reasonable expectation of what their, safety and efficacy will look like. As far as rare, ultra rare, we really have to crack the code on what model is going to work for the smaller patient populations. And I'm not actually, I'm sort of going in that, gray area that's sort of between the individualized treatments and the larger rare. There's just a lost middle that I think doesn't get as much attention that we really need to think a little bit differently about.
Great. Kevin?
Yeah, I think if we do take it from the perspective of our desire to do the best we can for each and every patient in the world, then the fact that somebody has something that very few other people have, if you've seen one tumor, you've seen one tumor. So I'm sorry, there's something that no one else has ever had. So it's a perspective where we could change the whole global outlook on this in terms of saying we're just going to treat every patient to the best of our ability, we being global healthcare. And how can we do that? And working together with different communities, I think, is the way to reach that sort of global understanding. Even though there's going to be a lot of cultural different perspectives, as I mentioned, I think we can achieve a connection in terms of every community wants to care for their individuals. Right. How that happens specifically, okay, there's your innovation and adaptation and all that. But the idea that everybody counts, I think, is the key.
Yeah. Great.
I know we're over time, but I just want to end on the note that as a pediatrician, it's all about the kids. You know, it's global access, and you start with the children. You know, imagine if we, you know, the sickle gene therapy had broad access in Africa, for example. I mean, even, you know, I'm from New Zealand. We don't even have commercial CAR T cells there. So, you know, if we can start with the children for the ultra rare diseases, most of them are children, and, you know, for these novel cell and gene therapies, start with the children, get the global access, and they are our future.
Okay, good, thank you. We'll end it at that. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panel.
And our moderator.
And our moderator.
Of course.